good morning. I'm super thrilled to be here and also at the same time really humbled by the amazing folks here in this room. So I am presenting some of my work today on, broadly speaking, the materiality of learning. And so this work is informed by my background in new media arts and design from Aalto University, and also the learning sciences background from Indiana University and UCI. So currently, I'm a tenure-track assistant professor here at the Technical University of Munich as part of the School of Social Sciences and Technology and the Institute for Advanced Study. So the work that I do is very educational researchy. And so today, I'm trying to keep it a little lighter, right? But that's all to say, if you have any questions about the nitty-gritty kind of details of the research, please come to me and I'm happy to talk about it. So I really want to share some kind of recent insights from the learning sciences and the things that I learned about design. And so to start this talk, I'd like to just kind of do a little bit of a thought activity for you on something to keep in the back of your mind throughout the talk that we'll come back to in the activity part. So I'd like you to think of an object from your childhood that was really meaningful to you, and you kind of keep carrying forward into your design practice and your design educational practices today. And so you can start thinking about it, no pressure if you can't think of anything just yet. Keep kind of turning those wheels. And so please remember this object and then bring it with you to the hands-on kind of part. So throughout my work, I really come to find that if we change the tools and materials that we use for learning, then we can change how participation within STEM and kind of technical fields happen, but also who participates in these areas. And so now I'd like to tell you just a little bit more kind of about my background and the kind of theoretical commitments that I take throughout my work. And so this is getting a little theoretical, but the good news is that theory in educational design is actually really purposeful and pragmatic because it really helps us guide the kind of design decisions that we are taking, because we can start to build on what kind of is the state of the art of learning and make decisions based on that. And so my work kind of stands at this intersection of the learning sciences and design scholarship. And so my approach to design is really grounded in participatory design from the more Nordic countries, and so kind of how people and materials contribute to the design of STEM learning, right? And so really thinking about how can we organize the design process in a democratic way that also includes the materials as sort of participants in this. And so my approach to learning is really informed by constructionist and post-humanist kind of approaches. And so in this context of the talk, I focus more on the constructionist parts. And so this approach really assumes that people learn best when they engage in the design of personally meaningful objects that they can share with others. And so through the manipulation, like the physical manipulation, but also the digital manipulation of things, kind of the concepts that are part of these objects get internalized. And so just kind of giving you a little bit of a theory insight on the gears of my childhood activity. So this references kind of a foundational idea in constructionism that really objects can be at the same time physical things, but also kind of ideas in the heads of people, right? But also things that are kind of socially constructed in interaction. And so through this manipulation then of these objects inside the head, but also in like physical or digital space, learning can then be achieved. And so Papert kind of explained that the gears, like the actual gears, helped him in his childhood to understand complex kind of equations and served him as model for understanding. And so the gears were something that he was really passionate about, and he was able to use to translate these kind of abstract concepts. But he stresses that these gears are not really for everyone, right? And so this takes us then to another really fundamental idea within constructionism, which is really this idea of epistemological pluralism. And so that this idea of epistemological pluralism really basically acknowledges there are different ways of learning and there are different ways of knowing, and all of these are really equally valid. And so what this is inviting is not only to say, right, it's about what we kind of are passionate about, but also thinking about how can what we are passionate about be a source of passion for other people, and how can we widen that up to invite multiple passions to be part of these technical kind of explorations. And so now I'll move into a little bit more kind of concrete moves and sort of an excursion of recent research that I've had the pleasure to be part of, and so these pieces are really kind of individual studies, right, that I've conducted, and so like self-standing research work. But sort of rather than providing you with a full research overview, I want to keep it kind of relatively light and just kind of walk you through some of the major findings of these works. So this first excursion focuses on design for empathy. And so, in fact, we know that kind of promising research shows that the role of empathy in engineering is really a way to foster girls' engagement within engineering contexts. And so within a recent study, we investigated how engineering activities support girls in engaging in engineering in science museum settings within the United States. And so what we did, we observed 202 girls engage with these engineering activities. And so one of the activities was called Help Grandma. And so in this activity, we asked youth to kind of select cards that featured a character of a grandmother and a kind of a challenge that she experienced. And the youth were supposed to address this challenge by creating kind of an invention for that character. And we found that all of the and this is one activity example, and I'm happy to share more. But we found that all the activities that we studied were really inducive of engineering practices. So girls really engaged for a really long time within the science museum setting, and they really engaged in engineering practices, for example, persistence, testing, and tinkering. And they also illustrated some empathy practices, and these really clustered around perspective taking, familiarity, the desire to help, and user-centered design. And what was really interesting was when we brought these engineering practices in relationship with the empathy practices. Because what we saw was that when there was just a little bit of empathy kind of displayed and observable, the dwell time really tripled, and the the frequency of engineering practices doubled compared to when there was no empathy present. And I think this is really extraordinary and quite interesting because it shows two main things. First, we learned that to increase girls' participation with engineering, it's really important to invite perspective-taking and user-centered design. And second, we learned it is important to build on familiar objects and situations in order to get girls engaged. And so in my work, I'm really doing this by inviting materials and objects that are familiar to a broad range of folks, right? And to give people the opportunity to work with things that they already know and build up on that. The next excursion really focuses on diversity of materials. And then so in this study, I investigated whether 3D, three-dimensional mental rotation, so the way you imagine like a thing turning in your head, the outcomes of these for boys and girls vary depending on the perceived gender of the materials that are being rotated. And so first, I asked one cohort of youth to gender sort everyday objects, for example, this lemon. And so then we asked another cohort to take a novel 3D mental rotation assessment, in which we asked the youth to mentally rotate these everyday objects that had been gender sorted. And so I observed that the objects that were really perceived as feminine led to higher learning gains for all of the students. But these gender stereotypical outcomes that favor males really only persisted with gender nondescript objects. And so these results really show that there isn't really this gender neutrality of materials, right? And so if we take kind of materials into consideration, we may be able to remove some of the gender differences that have long been considered kind of innate for boys and girls, and designing with these kind of socio-historical practices that are associated with people that are often underrepresented within a field can help us broaden learning outcomes and hopefully also broadening participation. This work is really in line with some of the recent findings by a colleague at TUM in the area of leadership and management that shows similar kind of results in hiring practices. So the excursion number 3 focuses on aesthetics as technology innovation. And I think this is really something that's probably really quite familiar to many of you in the room, especially those of you within fashion design or kind of fashion technology areas. So in this work, we were really looking to think with the active role of materials, and this really led us to consider kind of collaborations as an activity that happens not only between people but also among people and the things around them. And so this led us to reconsidering the actors within this collaborative space. And I investigated this in a kind of collaborative learning setting with crafters that we interviewed and about their engagement with craft materials. And so we conducted interviews with 85 adult crafters and also observed their practices within their own home studio spaces. And in our kind of interactive, iterative analysis, we zoomed in on how crafters talked about collaborating with these materials in ways that really informed their material practice and their routine engagements, which we then refer to as a technological invention. And so one overarching theme that we found was really related to sensory collaboration. This included collaborating with the visual elements of the material. And so the crafters explained how they used sight, but also their tactile sense to really engage with the quality of the material, the visual quality of the materials, while the materials also made these qualities available to them. So it was really like this kind of back and forth going in between. And so one example was of a quilter who explained how she kind of followed the pattern of the fabric or the printed fabric in generating the quilt that became then a much more dynamic stitch compared to kind of this typical quilting in the ditch, meaning sewing the fabric together at the or kind of sewing the fabric and the padding together at the space of the seam. And so what was really interesting from my point of view is that these decorative elements within these craft materials that we often really undervalue became places for innovating new technological practices, right, that we can then name and point to. All in all, we cannot really affirmatively say whether it was the crafter's kind of insight, right, or the material, the presence of the material that produced these expansions of these crafts. But in and of itself, I think that it really starts to kind of call into questions who is really the artist, who is really designer, how do we work together with these kind of materials, and what does this mean then for how we move technology forward? I think this study also presents a really interesting value on or revalues practices that are often kind of overlooked or pushed aside within technical areas such as decorating and aesthetics, and really foregrounds them as drivers of innovation and technological futures. So now I'm coming to the last quick excursion before we get more hands-on, which is really a focus on designing for recognition. And so this designing for recognition has been informed by my longer-term ethnographic work within maker educational settings within the United States. And so these were out-of-school settings, but also in-school settings, sort of a kind of a broad range across kind of East Coast, West Coast, and also Midwestern regions. But this particular space here is a makerspace in Baltimore, Maryland, and a space that I've really loved and I just so enjoyed spending time in. And so this makerspace, I observed Sierra here, and she augmented an old piano with electronics and crafts to create a digital jukebox piano that would then kind of play songs from a playlist when you press the piano keys. And so this piano project went on for a really long period of time. And this gave her the opportunity to engage with engineering practices and to show that she really was part of the space, the maker space, but also the space of engineering as a woman in this area who continue to be underrepresented in engineering. But over the course of this kind of several years of really engaging in this project and me observing her on the side, I observed that the project really developed and shifted positions within the makerspace. And so starting out from a very non-dominant position, kind of placed in the corner, facing the wall, as she continued working on it, it became more and more prominently positioned. And so people who came to visit the makerspace and touring it, different kind of political actors, right? People in public positions and educators and so forth, often took pictures of the space and then shared this piano project, tagging her along on the social media channels, which gave her really a public-facing opportunity to share her work, but also led to really a recognition of others, but also a self-recognition that connected her practice with engineering. Fast forward, this longer-term experience of designing and sharing this piano really led to her enrolling in a computer science undergraduate program. And so I thought this was really just such a wonderful case to illustrate how sharing the work of youth within the physical spaces, but also within the digital spaces, really can lead to such powerful changes in their trajectory. At the same time, this work then also shows that the mobility of technology projects that are created by youth or young designers within makerspaces can really make a difference in the people's lives' trajectories. And making this mobility possible can really counter some of the lopsided gender representation by making people feel recognized and like they're belonging within this space. So just kind of coming back together, all in all, these studies and kind of insight provide broad overview of really long-term inquiry, qualitative inquiry into the roles of material within STEM education and STEM learning, toward more, or with hopeful insights toward more equitable participation. And so I call these now in this setting as a design insights that can then share that can then lead into kind of questions that support the design of learning environments toward more diversified and equitable participation opportunities. So I share these questions here on the slide, but we'll get back into them next. So now we'll move into the more hands-on part, okay? And so I like to call this as a kind of design education with materials in mind. And so I would like to encourage you to start coming back to your childhood objects that you started to think of at the beginning of this conversation or talk. And to start to think or return to that idea how these objects could inform your design practice today or your design education practice. And then within that workshop part, I will also then ask you to work with kind of hands-on materials to think about how can you broaden an activity in connection to that object. With these questions of design insights in mind. All right, so let's get going. I think we've got 4 tables, so I'd love for you to kind of get into small groups and engage at these tables. And so in the first activity will be sort of like something like, let me check. Yeah, I think we have about an hour, correct? Okay, super. Or 45 minutes. I don't want to cut into lunch. So I think if you can kind of form small groups and start to discuss the question, what is a gear of your childhood? And how does this gear relate to your design practice? And then third, how does this gear relate to your design education practice? Okay. So this would be the first activity to go for. Then I'll come to you and we'll discuss and I'll share the next step of this work as well, okay?